a really great improviser or composer, you're always refining your craft, actually, so that it's sort of like learning, being able to speak a language fluently. So you have to do that nuts and bolts. Like if you're learning a foreign language, you have to study the vocabulary and learn all the grammar and practice using it. And then once you've practiced it, and also read a lot and listen. So you're listening to other music as a musician too, and looking at other models. And then all of a sudden you're able just to, to just to speak fluently without planning everything. So it's similar with music. So because improvisation also has a framework. So it's not just completely
not
open.
chaos. Yeah, it's not chaos by any means.
And it's not actually completely unprepared.
Across your website after I was looking into music recently, just because of I usually talk about philosophy of mind and things like that on my channel with people, and I had been reading a lot of old writings of the saints of the Catholic Church, like Augustine and people of that nature, and I started to see how much emphasis they placed on music as a way by which they drew analogies to construct their worldview. And I found that pretty fascinating. And then I saw your website, and your background was super intriguing. And I saw all the stuff you had been into and the religious element to it. It seemed like a great person to kind of ask these questions to, about the meaning, basically about music, meaning, and the whole thing. And it seems like, if you wouldn't mind, I was going to ask you I didn't say too much about your background there, but I didn't know if you wouldn't mind kind of explaining a little bit about how you ended up where you are now in music.
Yeah, sure. Well, I grew up in rural Minnesota and then in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and my parents were teachers for a conservative Lutheran denomination. And really my very earliest musical memories are being in this church. My father was the organist, and in rural Minnesota, and that's where I learned to read music, just by looking at the hymnal. We used hymnals, and I loved singing. And then, I was like 3. So, my parents both read music and they played keyboard, but they were not professional musicians. My dad's job was mainly a teacher, but he's a phenomenal musician as well. So during my childhood, I was actually almost self-taught at piano. My mother had a stack of piano method books, I guess from her childhood or something, and she showed me where middle C was on the piano. And when I was 5, and by the time I was 6, I was playing chorales on my own and playing them forward and backwards and turning the book upside down. And so I had found in my parents' attic, I found they had played trumpet and violin when they were younger, and I wanted to play violin, but the violin was too beat up. So, so I ended up starting trumpet lessons through a free program that was through our school. So that was the only formal music training I had as a child, but this program was really excellent, high quality. And so then I became a trumpet player, and I played the trumpet, and I was always playing the piano, always improvising. By the time I was in 5th grade, I was accompanying, pretty major things for my school. So more than just hymns. And so in high school, I started entering competitions on my own. I didn't have a teacher at that point either, but on trumpet and piano, and did really well. But, there was really my parents did not earn much, and they didn't really have the idea that I would become a professional musician. Was not part of the plan. So, but I decided that's what I wanted to do. And so with financial aid and scholarships, I started studying music at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, where I was growing up in Milwaukee. And I wanted to study composition, but I had no idea how you became a composer. I thought that you had to learn everything there was to know about music theory to be a composer. So I loved music theory, but I ended up then dropping trumpet, changing to voice. I heard singers. I love singing, and mostly I loved that they were singing in foreign languages. So I was really always very fascinated by foreign languages. So I'm German American. My family, they were in Wisconsin since the 1850s, but they spoke German at home, when my grandparents were young. And so I learned a little German, but I was always fascinated by foreign languages. So that's what really drew me to voice. And so I ended up, at the same time that I was studying piano the whole time, but I was concentrating on vocal performance. And at the time when I was an undergraduate, it was almost impossible to study composition unless you composed atonal music. You had to compose atonal music or you weren't considered a serious composer.
And atonal is, what does that mean? Sorry.
So atonal is, it's music that has no pitch is the center point. So, if you sing Happy Birthday in the key of F, it all revolves around that pitch F, and you have these memorable memories in tonal music because all the pitches are related and all relate to the tonic, the home pitch in a way.
Okay.
So all popular music is tonal. Most opera and lots of vocal music is tonal. But in the beginning of the 20th century, in Europe, atonality arose, and I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that because that is a philosophical. It's an ideology, and but that was very strongly promoted in academics, and that went, I would say, through the 1980s, 90s at least. It still is that way in some universities, but I ended up pursuing a performance career. I ended up, from age 18, I was actually working as a professional pianist, working for ballet companies and accompanying. And then I lived in Germany for 9 years, and I worked as a freelance musician there, both as a singer and as a pianist, and also as a choral conductor and a church musician. So I was putting together many things, as many musicians do. And when I returned to the States that was in 2000, I wanted to do my doctorate, and I sought a school where I could study composition at the doctoral level without having an undergraduate or master's degree in composition. And the University of Minnesota had a wonderful composition program. So I studied there. I studied both voice performance and composition ended up really being the main thing. But throughout this whole, I've always maintained, I've always still been a pianist. So, but then I really first started composing seriously, in that I didn't throw everything away. I had composed music, but I didn't save it. I threw it away because I had been told if it's not tonal, it's not serious. And so it's been since about 2005, 2004. And then actually what I've learned is all of my performance background was really the best training I could have had for composing. So that is my main activity as a musician. I mean, I am working as a part-time church musician, and I am organist and choral conductor there. But I am focusing mostly on composing other than that.
Awesome. That's really that's really neat. The whole I very rarely come across someone who has so much hands in so many different parts of music, composition to voice to study of it, and it's fascinating to hear how you got there. You've kind of known since you were 6 years old that you were going to play music, not necessarily in this role, but you knew that it was going to be this a key part of your life.
Yeah, it was, and it was interesting because there were people along the way who helped me. That was just the amazing thing. I had somebody who helped me find out how to apply for financial aid and who gave me piano music. And I had wonderful teachers. I was really blessed along the way. I had just fantastic mentors. So in a way, all the things that I do it's like a package that's kind of connected, you know, because a voice and piano and vocal music and being a vocal coach and then being a choral conductor and composing. But I do feel like I have this vocal music side and also instrumental side, because I've played so much instrumental music as well.
Awesome. That's really fascinating. And the thing I usually talk about when I talk about philosophy on my channel has to do with philosophy of mind and consciousness. And it's interesting, the idea of music composition and music in general has a critical part to play in it, because generally when I'm asking people about consciousness, we're talking about subjective feeling and experience and the quality of being that usually is a very difficult thing to describe or explain scientifically. And reading these older philosophers and theologians, they defaulted numerous times in their philosophical writings and metaphysical writings to music as a backbone analogy to trying to relate experience and being consciousness, how music can't really be understood without consciousness, without when somebody hears a music note played, if it's composed on a sheet of paper, it takes an active living person to bring it into consciousness. And then when it's received by a listener, it induces this subjectivity or this feeling of love, of happiness, of something like that. And music always seems to be able to, it's such a human thing. It's such a key part. It's all dependent upon the human experience and consciousness to receive the music, to play it, to compose it. And it's such a transcendental thing. It contains all of the transcendentals like beauty, truth, goodness, all of that stuff. I know very little about music composition, but I was fascinated to see how it's such a good thing to just describe the human experience.
Yes, that's exactly how I view it, that it is an expression of the human experience. So over history, there have been, especially in the beginning of the 20th century, tensions about what that means.
Yeah.
So, you know, music, it's a physical thing, which is so interesting because you can't see it and you can't grasp it somehow, but it does have physical properties, you know, acoustic properties. And it's, so it seems to be so connected to language. But in the early 20th century, when I was talking about atonality, so the philosopher Theodor Adorno, he wrote about how at the time he was criticizing the way that music was being used to sort of numb the masses or to influence them in a negative way. And at the same time, the composer Arnold Schoenberg had begun using this technique that he called 12-tone music, in which he wanted to do away with the hierarchy of tonality. So that no pitch would be home base, which would result in music that is not easily memorable. Like the melodies are not easily memorable because the pitches they're arranged by numbers, not by their relation to the tonic. And that he didn't invent that system, but he developed it as a composer more than anyone had before him. And this caught on, and it was considered a higher level of music. This is where I have a different opinion about that. I don't believe it's a higher level. I don't actually believe it's as high a level as tonality myself, but it's just a different way of arranging pitches. But that being said, you know, if music is an expression of the human condition isn't always happy and pleasant. So it depends whether, you know, what are you trying to elicit certain ideas or feelings, or are you trying to reflect ideas and feelings that already exist? And, you know, the first part of the 20th century in Europe was really, there was a lot of chaos going on, a lot of strife and a lot of, I mean, Arnold Schoenberg started composing before World War I, but there was already a lot of political tension going on in Europe at this time. So you have to look at every composer in context of their historical background, their social background. And the thing with that, a lot of musicians even don't understand about Arnold Schoenberg is that he was actually very interested in mysticism, and he wanted to create music that was actually not easily accessible to humans. Right, so that's how he attended it, and it's not easily accessible. And the reason is because it tries to avoid predictable patterns. That's the thing. So in tonality, there are we can kind of predict what's coming, and the best composers are able to kind of stretch that tension so that it's like delayed gratification, so that finally you reach the point where it feels really great, but you don't do it too soon or the music is boring and trite. But Arnold Schoenberg wanted to create music that that people could not know where it was going unless you listened to it over and over again and studied the row. And but he had philosophical reasons for this. I am not an expert on Schoenberg on his philosophical beliefs, but I do know that he was very interested in Schopenhauer and that he had discussions with Freud. And so the problem is that then his techniques were kind of adopted, and especially coming across to the US, suddenly adopted as this is how Western, how tonality has come to its, it's reached a level, there's nothing more that can be done creative with it, or it's, and now we're exceeding that and we're evolving to atonality. That's what I was taught when I was a student. And I remember sitting in my freshman music history class, and I was just thinking, that's just not true. I don't believe it. And my music history professor was telling us that, yes, in 20 years, children will be humming atonal tunes instead of children hum little tunes. Well, I said to myself too, that will never happen, and it never will. So our vocal apparatus is actually very, it's physically, I don't know what the right word is, not connected, but it's connected with the overtone series.
I see.
So yeah, so you know what the overtone series is?
I don't actually know what that is, but I was kind of understanding what you're trying to say, that it's like there's a tethering of it to that keeps it.
Well, it's physics, because the overtone series it's physics. It's a physical thing where if you play a pitch by plucking a string or blowing through a horn or whatever, then there are many sounds contained in one sound, and there's the lowest sound, that's the fundamental sound, and then the next sound that comes is 8 pitches above that. It's an octave, so it's just the same pitch, but it's higher. And then the intervals go up by then fourths and thirds and smaller, and every instrument, because of its the sound source, the string or the tube or whatever, has certain creates a certain timbre, but the overtone series remains the same. It's just that the waves are a little bit different. So our voice is like, if you sing, it's very easy to sing an octave. So if you go, that's really physically easy to do. That's because our voices are built that way. And the way we perceive, how are we able to hear music? Like, there's such a huge difference between us and animals. So, birds have songs, they communicate with each other, but it's really different from what we do with music as humans. And the way that our ears and our brain process music is miraculous. Like, it sort of defies explanation of how, if we hear a chord, how do we hear 3 different pitches, but we hear them also all in combination. And the way that the ear filters those sounds and then puts them back together, it's really remarkable.
Yeah, that is really fascinating, because in neuroscience, they talk about sensory binding a lot, which is a phenomenon that they talk about when trying to investigate the nature of consciousness. And the phenomena of sensory binding is basically in an example of like when an athlete would swing a tennis racket and make contact with a tennis ball, the sense of touch of the vibration of the racket and the sound of the ball hitting the racket and your vision, all of those signals arrive in the brain at separate times because they're a little bit delayed, and they come together in a interhemispherical connective region that'll take apart all of those different sensory datas. And you see it as one swing of the racket, but really you should have all of that a little bit off, and you should be feeling it right after you hear it and seeing the ball before you actually feel the touch. But the brain has a way of combining all the data together in such a miraculous way that we actually experience reality in the present as it occurs, as if we're hearing and touching and all of it. And so it kind of reminds me of that with what you're talking about.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, definitely. And that would definitely also relate to, like when you're playing the piano. So you're reading the music, and if it's something very virtuosic, like you might have to play a pitch really rapidly, way out here on the keyboard. The best pianists have perfect pitch. And so when they see the pitch, they can hear it before they play it. And knowing what that sounds like helps the brain calculate to, the finest millimeter, exactly how far to put your hand to reach it in a very, in a split second. So it's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's incredible. And like you said, it's miraculous almost, because it's difficult to explain the dramatic differences in, I mean, it's fascinating to know about hearing, about how the notion of hearing in the human ear and the brain is so refined compared to other mammals and animals. But additionally, it's the how we can use language in a way, like when we language in itself, the fact that we're the only species that can construct language in such an advanced way we have, to where we can communicate and we can spread ideas and form social institutions, is based upon the idea that we can communicate with words. And it's like this emergent phenomena in humans. I mean, all of a sudden you have no language really, and then you have extremely well structured language that we can transmit verbally from nothing really. No, there's no like missing link kind of thing between that and a lower level ancestor, which there may be, but it, like you said, it is kind of miraculous. And that is just one of the many things that's miraculous about humans. But language and music and the ability for us to discern is very, very unique and fascinating.
Yeah, and in different cultures, so we associate certain music with certain moods, right? So and especially in Western culture, we associate major tonality. So like a song like Happy Birthday, that's in a major key, or even the Star Spangled Banner. So and we associate that with happy or triumphant, whereas a minor tonality, we at least in our culture, we tend to say that's sad or reflective. And let's see, like the melody of Greensleeves, so that's in a minor key. And there are cultures where minor keys are used to express happier subjects or love, or so that's a little bit, it depends on the culture, but there's no culture that has adopted atonality as its natural expression.
Yeah,
So I find this really interesting, but
that
I
is
do think
interesting. Yeah, no, it is.
it's the patterns, and from depending on what the native language is of a composer, you can see certain intervals will be used more often for example, French music is really, if you know what French Impressionism is, it's very flowing in French art, in Impressionistic art, right? So the lines are not necessarily very defined, and it's there's this kind of shimmering quality, and it's kind of ethereal, and it's very flowing. And I mean, it's not that all French music is just flowing. There's also some really articulated music, but the language is, French language is very flowing, and you can see that in the music. And American music, it's partly probably the language, and then it also geography, believe it or not, influences how composers will compose. So for example, Aaron Copland is well known for his the Appalachian, what is it called? Appalachian Spring and Rodeo, these ballets that have this beautiful music that we really associate with. That's American music, and has lots of intervals of a fourth and a fifth, which are kind of open intervals. Well, he was portraying the wide open plains, this openness there. And so then that came to be sort of a stylistic in film music too, for depicting, Western scenes, so, but again, there's been a lot of discussion on whether you can come to appreciate atonal music. appreciate it, but I think, I don't believe tonality is dead by any means. So, and I'm not the only one. So,
Yeah, no, well, that's really fascinating to just know definitively what the atonal and tonal music is, and that there exists that schism kind of. I find it philosophically interesting how you mentioned the composer was kind of attempting to place it on a pedestal above tonal music, or try to promote its use for certain reasons, and it seemed like they had this idea. They thought maybe that it was trying to be used to like control people or hypnotize people or subdue them if they were to get too used to the music. And that thought in the night, you said, I think it was the 20th century in France, they had this shift in philosophical thought, mainly due to Foucault. And Foucault
yes.
was a postmodernist, and I kind of, or some people, I'm sure there'd be a lot of people who would say he's not a postmodernist, but to me, he reads like a postmodern philosopher, similar to Karl Marx even, but he had the same suspicions about those in authority in the government positions. He was one of the first philosophers to break into this philosophical schism with this idea that things were cooperative and everything was based on cooperation. To postmodernists got a very heavy suspicion of power. And so they thought everything that was being utilized in society was some secret plot by the white man to climb up to the highest levels of authority and then rule over everybody, and that everything was driven upwards by power only. And it kind of seemed kind of similar to that composer you're talking about, where he was kind of shifting into that postmodern school of thought, where there must be some sort of reason this music is trying to be controlled by the government or by the authority to use it for some. So there's kind of like Foucault has a lot of thoughts that remind me of what you were talking about.
So I don't know about Schoenberg's, about his, I mean, he was Jewish, and that played some role in his ideologies, but I actually don't know how much. I do know that, for example, there were composers in now his name is failing me, sorry. Eisner, he composed, they were called Kampflieder, which meant they were demonstration songs, and he composed them in post-World War II Soviet Union, and he was communist. And these songs were they were a lot of marches, and they were meant to get people to be activists.
I see.
So, so music has been used, in all these different ways, forever. And of course, it's been used in, as an expression of faith as well. Yeah. So, to me, it seems like it's a very natural part of being human. But then how it's used varies greatly.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's certainly a very human thing, and only humans, I guess, engage in musical, performances and listening and all that. But you're right. Yeah, the way in which it's made is definitely variable from culture to culture, and that's interesting because people can use that as a benchmark by which to judge a culture. This is their music comes from here. When you hear bagpipes, at least that's coming from Ireland or Scotland. Generally, it's like music carries with it a story that can be read by many different people in many different ways. I heard a discussion between some philosophers the other day that were trying to get at the core of, is music a story? And is because music and mathematics is looked at like this abstract language of the universe kind of thing, and they were trying to use it to analogize music. And then one of them pointed out that math is too deterministic. Music has unpredictability to it, and it has a little bit of it stays right on the line of chaos and order sometimes. Like if you think of a guitar solo, a guitar solo could go really wrong if it was not right, but it breaks in the middle of a really nice melodic track, and then you have this completely one instrument just in all different crazy awesome sounding ways, and that could that could easily not sound good, but for some reason it's like we kind of gravitate towards music that gets right on the edge of the chaos and the order, and that music does a good job of kind of, but he was a good point where he was like, mathematics is too deterministic, that it has a more of a story to tell, music does, and people all tell a different story when they hear it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because that's been a discussion with music, because for example, Schoenberg and serialism, that's called, it is, you form a row and you number the pitches, and then they're repeated in a certain order. So there's this connection with math. And of course, there's the physical acoustics of music can be sort of represented, right, with math. But I feel like the way that music affects us, emotionally, that it's more like a language. And it is that, yeah, this kind of, musical pieces are like stories, they kind of unwind, and you can't, when I'm teaching composition, one of the common problems I see with beginning composers is they want to put all these different ideas into the same piece. But to make a really good piece, that sounds coherent, that feels meaningful, you really need to use limited materials, and then you're varying those materials. But our ears pick up on, even if it's a few notes are they're inverted, or they're in retrograde, or there's but if you stick to just a few different musical materials, you can create large works on those small materials. Like the Beethoven, everybody knows the Beethoven Fifth Symphony, the da 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 dum ba 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 bum, right? So those two little intervals there are that's the core of that whole orchestral piece. So when you analyze it, that's Beethoven he presents that motif, and he just transposes just playing it in a different key. Like, so first it's G, 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 E flat, and then F, 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 D. So it's the same thing, but lower. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that's why studying Beethoven is great for composing, because you see what can be done with limited material. And I'm sure, this is the same for visual art too. You don't just have random, many, many different motifs going on in the same, you in one work of art, you have certain motifs, and you balance the colors, whatever you're doing. But
it's fascinating. It's like a lot of multiplicity comes from just a small amount of unity, produces all kinds of multiplicity. But like you said, you want to, like you're saying, the composition and math don't seem that I don't know a whole lot about music, but yeah, to me, it seemed too like it was putting too much parameters on it, because music has such a spin on it, its own unique, like human element to it. And we're talking about it being like a story. And composition must be kind of like writing a story, I would assume, or a little like, to a person who's not a composer like myself, that creative process of teaching that to others, that has to be a really cool thing, to get to see what compositions your students come up with, along with yourself composing, of course. But that creative process must be very fun to teach, especially if you have a passion for it, to see other composers. And so how do you start writing that story as a composer?
It all depends what I'm working on. So if I'm working on an instrumental piece that has no text, you have to set your own parameters usually. You can, a lot of us composers will use improvisation to just generate melodic ideas, and generate, sounds and chords. but a chord is not a piece of music, and a chord itself is just not interesting. So that chord has to be, there's a lot of emphasis these days because of electronics on like creating cool sounds. And that's okay if you create a piece that where that's the intention is just to explore sound, like that's a great thing. I do think though that to maintain people's interest and attention, you always though have to have the form has to, you have to know when to change. You have to know when the sound needs to change to keep people's attention. So, but if I'm composing an instrumental piece, you know, sometimes an extra musical idea will, I'll use that to generate some motif, and then I'll improvise with it. And I'll have an idea of what form I think I'm going to go for. Like I composed a violin sonata 2 years ago, and I wanted to compose the first movement in sonata form, which is, it's basically called an ABA form, where you have an opening section, and then you have a middle contrasting section, and then you return to the opening material, and it's a little bit varied. And I started with that idea, but I ended up with a rondo, which is kind of expanded. It's so you have the opening material and then something different. Then the opening material returns, and then there's something else different, and then it concludes with the opening material. So, but you do have to have, you know, just like a painter is like, okay, here's my canvas, this is how big it is. I also always think about who is going to be performing it. That is very important, because I want the performer to be both, to be challenged, but not to be overwhelmed. And I have to write idiomatically, you know, for the instrument or the voice. And then I'm also thinking about who my audience is, right? So that's a really important thing. So, you know, even if I would decide to compose something where I have no commission, I've just decided I want to compose this piece, I will start by thinking, who do I want to play with this? And who do I want my audience to be? And the process then of actually writing it, you know, it's, like I said, I use improvisation, but then I'll decide on kind of what my basic music material is. And then it just kind of spins out. And it's a weird thing, because you're really in a zone. And sometimes I get done and I think, how did I do that? So I was, several years ago, I went to a choral composing sort of symposium at Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. It was with the American Choral Directors Association sponsored this. And the composer, Stephen Stuckey, was there, who's a wonderful composer. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years ago from a brain tumor, but he was the mentor there. So, you know, I had showed him my piece and we were talking about it. And then I said, you know, I get done composing a piece and then I think, I don't know how I did that. And am I ever going to be able to compose anything again? Because I don't know how I did that really. Like I know I want to form, you know, but how I did it, you know, and he said, oh, I said, that's how I feel after every piece. And he won a Pulitzer Prize. So yeah.
So that made you feel a little bit better at that point.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And that's big. That's really nice to hear too, I bet, because I mean, I'm not a very creative person, but I could understand that if you've really put something to work like that and it's a completed piece and you are looking at it like it's some, you know, you don't know where it came from. You could be worried that you wouldn't be able to do it again, but then you realize, that other creative artists like that generally draw inspiration when they're in that zone from something else, from somewhere else, that kind of comes as you go, as you start the process of being creative. It kind of flows forth from there.
Right. Yeah.
That's
I mean,
neat.
I use, visual images, and then with the improvising, and, sometimes what I'm envisioning is not at all what the listeners will come to me and they say, oh, I heard this, or I saw this. And, that's fine with me, whatever they're, whatever they're seeing or hearing. So with texts, it's a little bit different, depending, the text definitely will influence your structure, and it'll influence, I mean, you can do many different things with the same text too, but if you're composing to a text, you're not just composing notes to words. You're trying to make the music itself be the words. So, to paint the words actually with the sounds. So
Yeah,
that's
that's fascinating to think about it, like how whenever you're composing music, you have to keep in mind that someone else will be delivering the performance, and how integral of a piece that is. Because in my head, I was kind of thinking of it, oh, this is kind of like writing a book, or potentially delivering, like being a stand-up comedian. The way you described the process of calling back to, or like the intro, I see a lot of similarities sometimes in music and comedy in the regards to that. Like the music has a chorus that it returns to, and a stand-up comedian a lot of times will start out a set with a certain topical nature in mind, and reference it, and then go on and get away from that topic, and talk around it for a while, and then call back to it late. I think they refer to it as a callback, but anyways, it's a stylistic technique that a lot of comedians put to work. And most of them, when you ask them how they structured that, they don't really know, but they know the process is something like this. They say, I start out with what my main bulk of my bit, and then I let it develop, and I step away from it, and then I make sure to come back to that original thought later on. And people, for some reason, grab onto that type of comedy delivery a lot. Like they tend to be like, they're like waiting, like, hey, when's he gonna talk about what he said? When's he gonna finish that punchline? It's like a long, delayed, extended punchline. The audience still wondering when it's gonna come back, and then the comedians somehow naturally do that. And I've heard some of them try to explain it, and they say, well, it's something similar to what you just said, where it's like a narrative, and they know they want to start here and they want to get back there, but how they get there is improv in the middle.
Oh, that's really interesting. And it kind of shows this principle of like what keeps people connected.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think it takes a lot of practice, and takes a lot of practice to be a good comedian too, right?
Yeah.
So you're practicing, and you're actually then if you're a really great improviser or composer, you're always refining your craft, actually, so that it's sort of like learning, being able to speak a language fluently. So you have to do that nuts and bolts. Like if you're learning a foreign language, you have to study the vocabulary and learn all the grammar and practice using it. And then once you've practiced it, and also read a lot and listen. So you're listening to other music as a musician too, and looking at other models. And then all of a sudden you're able just to, to speak fluently without planning everything. So it's similar with music. So because improvisation also has a framework. So it's not just completely open.
Chaos. Yeah, it's not chaos by any means.
And it's not actually completely unprepared.
Exactly.
Right.
That makes sense. Yeah, that's an interesting. There's a lot of parallels in the art of comedy and the art of music and the art of literature too. The way a story is told, the way that those kinds of forms of expression seem to have a lot of unique pieces within them that are very human in all regard, but they all center back to language in general. They're all backbone is telling a story requires a narrative and requires a framework by which to produce a narrative, which you need language. And learning language is difficult, like you just said. It's a long-term process. I wanted to ask you specifically. I like the French language. I can't speak it at all. I took like 3 years in high school, but I didn't.
Oh,
I didn't pay attention or something. So, but I enjoy the heritage, and I like the buildings and the architecture of France. So I wanted to ask you, you had spent some time in France at some point in your career as a musician, is that right? And I wanted to ask you
I,
about
s-
that and what France means to
yeah.
you.
Well, I spent 2 summers studying composition in Paris through the European American Musical Alliance. So that's a program that is a collaboration between faculty from the Juilliard School and then French faculty from the French Conservatoire and the L'École Normale de Musique. And it's a wonderful program. So that was back a while, 2006 and 2009. I studied there, and then I also have spent time in Sweden. I've been at a composer residency there 3 times on the island of Gotland in Visby, the International Center for Composers there. And I spent a summer in Norway, actually studying Norwegian. I actually put together a choir there and conducted a choir, but I was studying Norwegian. I had learned Norwegian as director of music at the Norwegian Memorial Lutheran Church, which is Mindekirken in Minneapolis. And everything was done in Norwegian there. And I was fluent in German because I lived in Germany for 9 years. And so learning Norwegian was easier because it's kind of sits between English and German, but it's also a tonal language. It's a beautiful language. But I got this fellowship to study advanced Norwegian there.
Wow.
And
that's fascinating. That's cool.
Yeah, I loved working at Mindekirken, and in fact, they commissioned me to compose 3 choral pieces for their centennial. So that's coming up at the end of October. I'm flying out there for that.
Oh, how exciting. That's awesome.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's that same weekend, actually, rather the few days before that, I'm presenting my opera for life at the National Association of Rights Protection and how is it, NARPA? I should know this, National Association of Rights Protection and Advocacy. So it's an organization that protects rights in the area of mental health. And yeah. So my opera for life, which was premiered by Baldwin Wallace conservatory students, and part of the Cleveland Opera Theater did a festival of filmed operas during COVID. So I was commissioned to compose this opera for that festival, and I had Cleveland Opera had performed a few of my other 2 of my other operas before that. And the director had approached me about possibly composing an opera about the opioid epidemic, because that was a few years ago when that was very much in the news. Mm-hmm. And I said to him, I think what needs to be composed is an opera about benzodiazepines, because that was a thing that no one knew about, but that I felt was as bad a crisis as the opioid crisis. And in the process of then doing my research for that opera, I learned actually that antidepressants are almost as dangerous as benzodiazepines and antipsychotics. So, I was motivated to do this because I had a family member who was very hurt by prescribed benzodiazepines, but had also been prescribed these other medications. So over the course of trying to help my family member and also write this opera, because I was writing the libretto, which is the story myself. So I discovered Mad in America, the organization Mad in America, which is an advocacy organization as well for mental health. And one of the co-founding editors, Kermit Cole, has a theater background and a film background. So I asked him if he would be an advisor for me for the and endorse this opera, and he volunteered to write the libretto, actually. So so we collaborated on it, and then you know, he wrote the libretto, I wrote the music, and I mean, we collaborated on the content of the libretto, you know, very much. So it was his perspective as a therapist, and then who is actually very engaged in the open dialogue therapy, which is a different kind of, much different than traditional therapy. It really brings a person is free to bring anyone they wish into the discussion, and that is really much more valuable for helping people through hard times, because we don't live in isolation. And so he and his partner do open dialogue in New Mexico, but he's also involved in a lot of other important activities. But he is, yeah, he has made films before, so he wrote this libretto. And you know, as I was composing this, I just kept learning more and more. And it was, that learning process was partly what I was seeing live day to day in the life of my family member. And then what I was learning from other individuals who also had been very harmed, actually, by these medications. And in the end, you know, what had happened is that what happens to a lot of people is that they have some kind of situation that leads them to feel like they're depressed or they can't sleep. And they go to their doctor, maybe not even to actually discuss that, but they fill out a form and they say, hey, you know, I've not been able to sleep lately, and so my immune system is down. And the doctor says, well, you should try this antidepressant. I mean, usually that's the doctors suggest it. Usually it's not usually patients going in and saying, I want to try this because I saw it on TV. I mean, that's what the TV ads try to, you know, get people to do. But it's pretty rare for a doctor not to just say this. I mean, I had a physician who actually once said to me, you know, I could tell you to go outside in nature for an hour every day, or I can prescribe this pill. Going outside in nature will have no negative side effects and will be more effective. So, but what happens is people are prescribed these things not knowing that, first of all, that there are some really not good side effects, and that they might even become oblivious to the side effects through this kind of, it's called Anasagnosia, like it's medication blindness, where you don't realize how you're coming across to people, and you can, you know, there can be anger and then some other physical side effects. But the big thing is that when people try to go off of them, all of a sudden they feel worse than they ever did before. And unfortunately, that too often is labeled mental illness, and then they're prescribed something stronger, and then they have a reaction to that, and then that's viewed as a sign of mental illness. And so what I learned is that this is happening to a lot of people, And a lot of people are reporting that when they go to their doctors and report this, their doctors say, oh no, that's not possible. The drugs can't be doing that. Or they'll say, well, it's okay, just stop the drug. And then they have horrible, serious withdrawal effects, but their doctors will say, that can't be, the drug is out of your system, and therefore it's not the drug. But that's not true, because the way the drugs work is they're flooding the brain, or creating making the body create chemicals in a way that it never did before. So the brain's receptors is shut down. And then when the drugs are gone, all of a sudden you're left, your brain is just left in a terrible state. And so people describe it, and I have to agree, having seen some of it, as torture. And I don't know if you're familiar with the psychiatrist Joanna Moncrief. She's in the UK.
I don't think so, no.
Well, she and a group of other of colleagues of hers, she has written on this in the past, but she just published a study that shows that there never was scientific a foundation for saying that depression is caused by a chemical imbalance. That was used to sell the drugs.
Yeah.
And so while then some psychiatrists are saying, well, that has nothing to do with whether they're harmful, it actually has everything to do with it. Because if there was no chemical imbalance, then these drugs are introducing chemicals that weren't there. And when they're taken away, what did that do? So that has elicited quite a heated debate. And I think more and more people who have been harmed are speaking out. Like there's the group Surviving Antidepressants has more than 100,000 members. And statistically, for every person who actually joined that group, there are who knows how many others who don't belong to the group because they're not on social media, or they're too ill, or they're ill because of the medications, but they don't know that it was the medications. So after realizing that this has happened, I actually came to realize that my younger sister, who passed away from leukemia about 9 years ago, she suffered tremendously and lost years of her life to these medications. And then in the last 2 years of her life, she had gotten off of all of them and was doing fine, and then developed this rare leukemia that usually strikes people who are older. So she was 35, and it's possible. I think there's a strong connection between those medications and the fact that she got leukemia. But even aside from that, she really lost her young adulthood to these drugs. They disabled her so much. And it all started with, my mother had cancer and she was anxious. And so she was given antidepressants. And so it's, I find it to be really a topic of historical proportions. And I've been criticized for speaking out about it. And I have said, I'm not criticizing anyone who is experiencing depression. I'm the first one to say you should never discontinue your medications suddenly, because I know, what these drugs do to the brain and how the brain needs time. And it's a grueling process to stop them for many people. What I'm saying is there needs to be support, and we need to look at why people are depressed. And we need to look at even what do we expect of ourselves. And it's just peeling layers of issues, and even the whole issue of, grieving has now become labeled a disorder. And that's just preposterous.
Yeah, no,
So,
that is, yeah, the DSM in psychology is now thicker than 10 Bibles. It's very, very
yeah.
thick book with a lot of diseases in it. Thank you for sharing all that. I agree with you. I think it's noble that you're bridging your work in music into this field in such a unique way. I think it's rare to see someone advocating for this in general and speaking out, but also finding a way to take what you already do, what you already do best in the world, and somehow even make a even greater good out of it. To transfigure music, it's like you take, how can I possibly advocate for victims of this problem and get the word out with what I already know how to do best, and to be able to do that that deserves a lot of credit. And like you said, it's not the easiest thing to speak out about, because everybody's going to tell you, first of all, who are you to say this? And they're not gonna compassionately or empathetically hear your subjective side of the story. And you can be labeled pseudoscientific, especially if you're in academia. So yeah, I know it's not an easy thing for a lot of a lot of the guests I've had actually do work in the alternative mental health field. I had a Dr. Anoop Kumar is a really good guest I had on, who's a great doctor and a fascinating approach to mental health, and he's come to these conclusions as well. I mean, he's an emergency room physician, but he practices mental health basically in a hybridized way with different cultures' treatments of these disorders, and sees the mind as something that we don't even know where it's located. We don't know enough about it to be diagnosing it. And so he has a lot more open-ended approach to this with a and like you said, the neurotransmitter link and causation of neurotransmitter deficiency linked to some sort of state of consciousness like depression is not solidified, and that's coming to the fore now. At least it seems like in psychology journals and things that this is being highlighted and proven. So I mean, when you're taking drugs that are preventing the reuptake, or forcing the reuptake of neurotransmitters, when you don't really know, neurotransmitters just a word given to a chemical. There's multiple things that contribute to your overall affect, and how you, whenever I talk about consciousness with people, I've come to realize that the doctors that I've talked to, the medical doctors who, when we talk about consciousness, I've come to realize that the state of consciousness that you have is defined by your state of feeling, happy, depressed, sad. And generally, that's what you use to say what consciousness is. Consciousness is the ability to feel depressed. Well, how do we end up feeling that way? And how do we get there? Well, a lot of times, physics people who have done work in this, like on active inference and free energy principle, is the idea that we build up a template of how the world should be and how it tells us we should be. And if the world has this whole dichotomy of you and other, and the world is saying you should be this way, and you can't, but you're always striving to, it creates an active inference error, and essentially creating, as a byproduct of that, anxiety. The affectual state of anxiety manifests at that point, because your template of what the world should be doesn't match up with how it wants you to be in it. And essentially that's a philosophical rambling, but it's interesting to talk to so many people in different disciplines come to these conclusions about depression that you just highlighted, the inability to prove the causation between neurotransmitters and depressive states is also just, there's something ultimately wrong with your pattern of being. And generally, and a lot of times it can go back to its masking of something that's not, you're treating neurotransmitters, but the whole cognition and state of consciousness isn't embodied and enacted and extended into the world. And so a lot of neuroscientists will use this 4E neuroscience, which is like enacted, embodied, extended consciousness. And so consciousness isn't just here in your brain. It's like, it's how you engage with the world. It's a reciprocal back and forth, and how we expect the world to be versus how it appears to us creates different states. And so you're inevitably masking over something where you've got this error. And so I think, that being said, it's a long way to just kind of reiterate kind of that I agree with you. And I think that what you're saying is just being more and more, even by neuroscientists, by physics, by physicians, physicists, physicians, all of them are hinting at the same idea, a lot of them that I spoke to. So I think that you're not alone, at least in where this is headed.
Yeah, and that's what has been really encouraging. So I've just been along the way, I've just been collecting, I've been reading, I've been collecting books, and I know that the science is like backs actually, what
Yeah.
I'm saying. And so I know that if someone is saying something to me like, oh, you don't know what you're saying, that they actually haven't studied it,
Yeah.
and they're hearing what's coming from actually the drug company kind of media messages. So
Yeah.
it's really interesting what you're explaining here. That's fascinating, and it's encouraging. And I mean, that just makes perfect sense. And that I think that's kind of what the idea of open dialogue is yeah. I don't know if you know about the success that they had in northern Finland with the that's where open dialogue started. And I should know the name of the person who started that that project there. But in fact, I learned about this from a colleague of mine who I was teaching with at Hiram College, who told me about it. He's a neuroscience professor, and how their instead of medicating someone who had some kind of mental health issue, they took them out of their stressful environment and supported them in a community setting, and their serious mental illness rates dropped 80%.
Wow.
So
I
that's
don't doubt
amazing.
it either. Just
Yeah.
it seems to make sense.
Hmm.
That's
So there
fascinating.
are efforts around the country around this country, around the US, to get this modality of care available in more places. So,
Yeah, no, and it's wonderful the attention anybody can bring to it, and yourself being able to blend music and to bring awareness through that is just a cool way of seeing someone take something that's not directly involved and take their skill set and utilize. That's what it's all about. Is what everybody's good at something unique usually, or very good at something that somebody else isn't. But it can all be music, especially has such a dynamism in it. The way it can be attributed to so much. I mean, like you mentioned the Star Spangled Banner earlier. Just the story of how that was written carries with it history, and then the song itself brings a feeling of patriotism to people. And then the way you could take music and make it tell a story of history. You can bring music to tell a story about the victims of mental health problems. You could take it to teach it to students who will then
yes.
it's far reaching, and it's just a lot of depth to music, and music can teach a lot. People seem to, even in the classical ages, have riddled the pages of a lot of philosophers because it's such a dynamic analogy making mechanism by which people can make these concepts that are so abstract more palatable. And so I think it's your efforts and everything. It's been really neat hearing about all of them, and I really think the conversation was really cool, how it came back to music but also brought that in there. So I just wanted to say all of that and reiterate how much I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I think that your interviews are really interesting. And so thank you for doing that.
Absolutely. I appreciate that. That means a lot to me. And once again, it means a lot to me for your time today. I really enjoyed it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Have a good one. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.